Hello everyone, welcome to the Logos Project. This is your host Dom. This episode is a reflection on part of John Paul II's theology of the body. Hello everyone. So, in this episode, I'm going to go ahead and kick things off with a reflection on audience 57 of John Paul II's Theology of the Body. So I'm simply going to begin by reading straight out of the text, and then I'll comment on it. In our meeting a few weeks ago, we focused attention on the passage in 1 Corinthians in which St. Paul calls the human body, quote, temple of the Holy Spirit. He writes, quote, "Or do you not know that your body is a temple of the Holy Spirit within you, which you have from God, and that you do not belong to yourselves? For you were bought at a price." So John Paul is quoting here from 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 19 and 20. He's drawing attention to the fact that St. Paul speaks of the body, the human body, and he focuses here on the fact that our bodies do not belong to ourselves in a kind of, you might say, kind of a Lockean understanding of private property. So for Locke, private property it belongs to us, which means that you can do whatever you want with it. It's utterly yours. So if you want to go ahead and, torch your house, blow it up, if you want to take your car and just destroy it, and put it, just have fun and destroy the heck out of it and put it in the dump, you can do that because that's yours. It's not someone else's. So for Locke, his understanding of private property relies on a different metaphysics, on a different anthropology, and we'll have to talk about that more. But for Aquinas and for many others in the Christian tradition, private property is understood in the terms of dominion. Dominion means you have a responsibility of stewardship over something that doesn't belong to you initially because it's a gift, right? So the Christian metaphysics explains that creation itself is a gift from God to man, and man's priestly role is to give it back to God in an offering, right? So it's an act of thanksgiving for having received the gift. So the idea of dominion here is that I am in charge of this aspect of the great cosmic gift, and my responsibility is to make sure that I enable this part of the cosmic gift to fulfill its purpose. That is the responsibility of my dominion. So ultimately, it's in the gift of self that man finds himself, that he finds true happiness. So it's never an inward metaphysics of possession in the sense of this is mine and its purpose is to satisfy my needs. Now, I'm not saying that satisfaction of needs is like this evil, unacceptable thing. There's a proper understanding of satisfying one's needs that is congruent with the Christian metaphysics. The question is always why, right? Why is this for this? Why is this for this? What's the purpose? Satisfaction of need is in order to be able to exercise our responsibility. Because if you don't satisfy your needs, then you're going to be handicapped. You cannot fulfill your purpose. So we always have to keep the end in mind here. This is, we find this in Plato, Aristotle, the Jewish scriptures. We find this understanding of God being the sole end of the human being, of the human person. You find this in the Christian traditions, in the patristics. It's all throughout the classical world. And so we have to keep that in mind. So this is why St. Paul says here in 1 Corinthians 6 that our body is a temple of the Holy Spirit. It doesn't belong to ourselves, but it belongs to the Lord, as he'll say later on. So then John Paul says, quoting St. Paul, so quote, "Do you not know that your bodies are members of Christ?" End quote. This is 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 15, prior to those other two. So he's showing here that we belong to Christ, not merely to ourselves, not the inward turning, towards ourselves. So the apostle shows, so this is John Paul speaking, the apostle shows how the mystery of the, quote, redemption of the body, end quote, achieved by Christ is the source of a particular moral duty that commits Christians to purity, to the virtue that Paul defines elsewhere as the need to, quote, keep one's own body with holiness and reverence, end quote. That's a verse from 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verse 4. So let's recap this first paragraph here of Audience 57. In other words, our body is the temple of the Holy Spirit because it belongs to Christ. It is grafted onto Christ, who has established his church, the church being the mystical body. And so, because we're part of the church, right, which is the new temple, in a sense, we are, you might say, microcosmic temples of the macrocosmic temple of the church, which, ultimately is aimed at the redemption of the entire cosmos, right, so that Christ might be all in all. So this is why we need to keep our bodies with reverence. And this is the idea of purity, because the body signifies the person. It signifies the interpersonal communion for which we are destined, right? So we're going back to the end. So the end of what I possess is that which determines how I exercise my responsibility over that thing I possess. So this is not Lockean. It's Christian. You might say it's Thomistic. It's what we call the universal end of all goods, because creation is a cosmic gift. All right, so moving on to paragraph 2 of Audience 57, John Paul says, "Yet we would not discover the full depth of the richness of thought contained in the Pauline texts if we did not notice that the mystery of redemption bears fruit in man also in a charismatic way." Okay, so what does he mean here? So let's go ahead and explain that. So the mystery of redemption bears fruit in man, in the human person, in a charismatic way. So the word charismatic here is important. Right away you think of the Holy Spirit when you think of charismatic, and that's correct. So he goes on to say, the Holy Spirit, who according to the apostles' words, enters into the human body as into his own temple, dwells there and works with his spiritual gifts. So the body is the temple of the Holy Spirit, which means that the fruits of the redemption, which take place within the human person, plays out in a charismatic way, a way that is linked to the Holy Spirit. And so John Paul continues, among these gifts known to the history of spirituality as the 7 gifts of the Holy Spirit, and here he's referencing Isaiah 11, chapter 11, verse 2. The one most congenial to the virtue of purity seems to be the gift of piety, in Greek, eusebeia, and in Latin, donum pietatis. So he continues, if purity disposes man, quote, to keep his own body with holiness and reverence, as we read in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verses 3 through 5, piety, as a gift of the Holy Spirit, seems to serve purity in a particular way by making the human subject sensitive to the dignity that belongs to the human body in virtue of the mystery of creation and of redemption. So let's break open that line from John Paul here. Purity is not defiling the body in a certain sense. So what that means is that the body is defiled when it's treated as something less than what it actually is. So if you look at a woman with lust, what you're doing is you're not seeing that woman in all of her subjectivity. Her body represents the very subject. It shows forth who she is, what she's for, all these aspects of her essence, of her nature, and also especially of her personhood. And so the moment you look at her with lust, then it reduces the woman from a subject to an object. So it takes away that dynamism in the authentic look. We often hear in the Gospels that Jesus looks at people in a specific way. This is repeated oftentimes. In one part, I think in Matthew, Jesus looks at the rich man and loved him. So Jesus' look is authentic, while the look of lust, which he talks about in Matthew 5, is reductive. It takes away that subjectivity, that fullness of existence, that fullness of being. And what it does is it makes that person into an object merely for use, right? So this goes back to the Lockean understanding of private property. And so that's why that, a woman is not a slave that is manipulated for use. She's a person that is loved in her fullness. So this actually will shed light in Paul's words in Ephesians 5, which have often been used to, say that Paul was sexist. But if you understand this properly, it shows that what Paul has in mind is intersubjective submission and an authentic love, not the ownership of a person as if she was an object, or vice versa. So again, we have the Lockean understanding of private property versus the Thomistic understanding of dominion, which is to be responsible for the direction of what we possess towards its proper end. Okay, so I'm going to reread this phrase. It's so important. If purity disposes man to keep his own body with holiness and reverence, as we read in 1 Thessalonians, piety, as a gift of the Holy Spirit, seems to serve purity in a particular way by making the human subject sensitive to the dignity that belongs to the human body in virtue of the mystery of creation and of redemption. So piety helps us maintain purity. How? Because piety, in a sense, it venerates the full authenticity of the dimensions, all the dimensions of the person. It doesn't reduce the person to a mere object. So impurity is a result of a lack of piety, a lack of respect for the person. So, thanks to the gift of piety, John Paul continues, Paul's words, quote, "Or do you not know that your body is a temple of the Holy Spirit within you, and that you do not belong to yourselves," end quote, take on the convincing power of an experience and become a living and lived truth in actions. So Paul's words about the body being the temple of the Holy Spirit and it not belonging to ourselves in the Lockean sense, those words take on, thanks to the gift of piety, an experience. And it becomes a way of living the truth in our actions, the truth of the full authenticity of others and of our own bodies. Right? We respect our own bodies as the temple of the Holy Spirit. So this is kind of where the church's teaching on purity comes from. Right? We don't abuse others. We don't abuse ourselves. We respect the full authenticity. Right? This is the gift of piety. The virtue here helps us live out this truth in our actions, in our everyday lives, in how we interact with other people and even ourselves. So, this is tough. Reading John Paul is tough because his phrases are so long, and you have to locate the subjects and the verbs and connect them properly. So John Paul continues here. He says that St. Paul's words also open fuller access to the experience of the spousal meaning of the body. Let's stop right there. In other words, reverencing the body as a temple of the Holy Spirit and understanding that our bodies do not belong to ourselves, this teaching, it opens up a fuller access to the experience of the body. Paul's words help us fully to understand the meaning of the body. So in other words, I can say the body, can have a kind of biological understanding of the body. Biology 101, it has organs. We can study the skin, we can study the hair, nails, and how it's made up, the eyeball, which is really fascinating. You can have that kind of understanding of the body, but the body is more than that. The body signifies something that is not material. It signifies the person, right? And so there's a sense in which the knowledge of the person, right, is not just an abstract knowledge, but it's an experience which comes forth when we speak with others, when we interact with others. And bodily expressions convey messages, they convey meaning, right? But ultimately, the body as a whole, as an expressive whole, conveys the person, right? And so what the body shows forth is that persons are gifts. They're gifts to each other. So this goes back to the idea of the cosmic gift, right? And it goes back to ownership and use versus love. And so the person is a gift to someone else. And so what that means is that this understanding of the body being a temple of the Holy Spirit and also being not for ourselves, but for others and ultimately for God. What these words do is that it shows the spousal meaning of the body. Spousal, here meaning the total gift of self to another. And so this reveals a mystery, right? A mystery of the communion of persons. And the ultimate communion of persons is the Holy Trinity. So Paul's words, not only do they show the spousal meaning of the body and the freedom of the gift that's connected with the spousal meaning of the body, but they reveal the deep face of purity and its organic link with love. So what is revealed in the body, if it's seen for what it fully is, which is something that shows forth the person, then what we see is that purity and love belong together. So purity here means seeing the person authentically, right? Blessed are the pure in heart. And also Jesus talking about looking at a woman and desiring her in your heart. So what we mean here is that purity is to love someone genuinely for who they are, which is why we can speak of the purity of spouses even though they are married and consummate their marriage. There's nothing impure about the marital act, right? That would be going down into Manichaeanism. So there's a beautiful understanding here where the marital act is an expression of the gift of the person that is incarnate, right? The expression is incarnate. But it never ought to be an exchange which is an exchange of use and lust, right? A reductive exchange where you treat your wife or your husband as an object and not as a person. So there's a tendency a lot of times to reduce the other. Okay. In paragraph 3, John Paul continues, although keeping one's own body with holiness and reverence is formed by abstaining from unchastity, and this way is indispensable, nevertheless it always bears fruit in the deeper experience of the love that has from the beginning, and he puts beginning in quotes here, referring to Genesis, been inscribed in the whole human being, and thus also in his body, according to the image and likeness of God himself. For this reason, Paul ends his arguments in 1 Corinthians 6 with a significant exhortation. Quote, therefore, glorify God in your body. So what we have here is, it's an exposition on the virtue of piety and its connection to purity. Both piety and purity have a proper understanding of the body at its center, right? So when John Paul says, although keeping one's body, quote, with holiness and reverence, is formed by abstaining from unchastity, in quotes, nevertheless it always bears fruit in the deeper experience of the love that has been inscribed in the human being. So this basically recapitulates what he was saying earlier, which is that it's not just this idea of abstaining from something, of abstaining from abuse or use, right? But it's also something positive that bears fruit into an experience, a positive experience. And it's the experience of the love that has been inscribed in the human being. This love is inscribed in man according to his image-bearingness of the triune God, who is a communion of persons. So man and woman, the human person, has two different incarnations of the gift of self, of the communion of persons. To be a person is to be directed towards communion. And so masculinity and femininity is inscribed in our bodies because it shows forth the very mystery of the subject, of the person. So that's why our bodies have spousal meaning. Purity as a virtue or ability of, quote, keeping one's own body with holiness and reverence, allied with the gift of piety as a fruit of the Holy Spirit's dwelling in the, quote, temple of the body, causes in the body such a fullness of dignity in interpersonal relations that God himself is thereby glorified. That's key. I'm going to reread that slowly and try to comment on it. So purity as a virtue, or, he says, purity as an ability of keeping one's body with holiness and reverence, allies itself with the gift of piety, which is a fruit of the Holy Spirit within us, right? The Holy Spirit dwells in us as in a temple, and that fruit which is born from this indwelling is allied, that piety is allied to the keeping of our own bodies in purity. So purity and piety here are allied, and they both cause in the body such a fullness of dignity in interpersonal relations that God himself is thereby glorified. So when we reverence our own bodies, and when we reverence the bodies of others as temples of the Holy Spirit, it is God who is glorified. And the reason why is because what we're reverencing through piety, which is possible through our purity, is the dignity of the body as temple of God. And that dignity is a dignity which is defined by the spousal meaning, by the image-bearingness that the body is. So when we reverence the body, we reverence God, because the body points to God. Okay. Then he says, purity is the glory of the human body before God. So remember, he's tying this to the concept of redemption as well, right? And the indwelling of the Spirit. So we really have a beautiful, what scholars call inaugurated eschatology here, where the new age, right? And Jesus talks about the new age where we will not be given in marriage to one another. And we'll have to talk about that in a separate episode. But this new age has dawned, although it is not fully here yet. And the way this becoming age is taking place is that the redemption is unfolding within us. And so that's why our bodies are temples of the Holy Spirit, which is the one who is moving the cosmos towards its goal. Remember the difference between use and responsibility and love? Here, the Holy Spirit is moving that which is under our own dominion towards its end, the fullness of all things, which is where Christ is all in all. Christ being the one who inaugurated this new age through his resurrection. So in other words, the life of the Spirit within us is resurrection life that is playing out and changing us from within, right? And so it's important to understand this connection between the resurrection and the work of the Spirit within us. Finally, John Paul continues. He says, from purity springs that singular beauty that permeates every sphere of reciprocal common life between human beings. I'm going to stop right there. From purity, from this virtue of keeping ourselves from unchastity, but also of experiencing the dignity of the other through the gift of piety, right? From these virtues here springs that singular beauty that permeates every sphere of reciprocal common life between human beings.